Well, on September 8, the world received the news of the death of the Queen of England, Elizabeth II. The Queen died at the age of 96, having spent 70 years on the throne. Her reign is remembered for many reasons, and the memory of her lifetime elicits different emotions and reactions. Queen Elizabeth II has drawn praises, tributes, and criticisms almost in equal measure, even in her death. A truly global human, her actions, words, and inactions have become burning topics for analysis. What the British throne and the country's history of colonialism means vary by nations, and the expectations of the rest of the world in their dealings with Britain have become topical issues. How will the Queen's death impact on the rest of the world, especially Africa, where the British footprints are still very evident? What is about to change and what will stay the same? Welcome to VSA. I'm Sulaiman. Also, last week, shortly after the announcement of the demise of Queen Elizabeth II, various reactions followed the passing away of the former oldest monarch in the world. Her death saw tributes from many, but it was also a moment to recall the British high-handed approach during its colonialist years. Queen Elizabeth II lived through generations and could be said to have adjusted with seasons, but her footprints leave different emotions in different people. Many African leaders have expressed sadness over her death, but their people, especially those who felt the impact of the presence of the British negatively in the colonial years, had only criticisms. Reviewing the actions and lifetime of the Queen is a deep inquest into her practice and how she went about her relation with Africa. While some say the celebration of her life is a betrayal of the struggles of Africans, others would rather focus on what's coming. The feeling is varied across the continent, but how would one describe the life and times of Queen Elizabeth II from an African perspective? Joining me tonight is Professor Tinashe Nyamunda. He's a researcher, financial and economic and social historian from Pretoria in South Africa. Also, our very good friend, Professor Macharia Munene, who's a professor of international relations, United States International University, Africa. He joins me from Nairobi, Kenya. And of course, someone who's always been with us on the square, Ejike Okpa. He's a global affairs analyst. He joins me from Dallas, Texas. Gentlemen, good to see you all, and thanks for your time. Now, let's start with you, Professor Munene, and you're here on the continent. How would you describe the passing of Queen Elizabeth II? How did the news come to you first as a person, Professor Munene?
Thank you. The death of Elizabeth II, it was not a surprise given her age and the fact that she was lonely, but her death marks an end of an era. The era of people who are associated with colonialism, whether positive or negative. She is the last of the monarchs to have presided or to have reigned over a large colonial empire. The interesting thing, one of the interesting things about her is that the first Queen Elizabeth created the British Empire, and the second Queen Elizabeth oversaw the fragmentation of that empire, territorial colonialism, and then watched or helped to smoothen the ruffled feathers into the Commonwealth movement, which built her. She built it or helped to build it, such that people have good memories of her, mainly because of her role in the Commonwealth. She traveled quite a bit, and wherever she went, she was received well. She emitted positive vibrations where she went. So even though people were critical of British colonialism, and colonialism was slavery in situ, they not always associate that trouble with her as a person. She was symbol of a bad system, but the person appeared to be okay, especially the way she handled the transition from colonialism to independence, and then the move into the Commonwealth. And in her time, the Commonwealth expanded, not just those places that have been British colonies, but we had Mozambique and Rwanda join because they thought it was a good thing. So that is an expansion in itself. And to a large extent, it can be accredited to her that she gave out a positive image of the Commonwealth that other people would want to be part of.
All right, Professor Munene, let me bring in Professor Nyamunda. You know, listening to Professor Munene, he said that's the end of an era. And of course, also talking about some of the key things there. But for some others, they say for someone who came on the throne at a very young age and was able to stay out of politics is something unprecedented. Help us make sense of that history, Professor Nyamunda.
All right. Thank you. First of all, thank you for inviting me to the show. It was wonderful to be here to share my perspectives on the passing of the Queen. But yes, the Queen did rise to the throne in 1952 at a very young age. But whether she stayed out of politics or not, I suppose is open to debate. She was very careful in terms of how she related with the British government, understanding the role of the monarchy, particularly in the context of the mid to late 20th century. But certainly the British government did utilize Queen Elizabeth when necessary. So in the post-Second World War period, with the creation of the Commonwealth of Nations, for instance, the Queen and her husband, Prince Philip, were particularly useful in terms of trying to revamp sort of neo-colonial or post-colonial relations with most of the former British Empire. And therefore, they had to take that tour around the world, particularly under the premiership of Winston Churchill. So, you know, the Queen has been instrumental in many different ways, and she has remained the benefactor of the Commonwealth throughout this period to date. And certainly, one of the reasons that the monarchy has survived for so long is that it has been able to sort of revamp its image and rebuild itself in ways that retained certain parts of British history, its former imperial glory, and certainly in the UK, it is certainly fondly remembered for that. How it is remembered in Africa is something also that's open to debate. And you know, her death has conjured up numerous different kinds of feelings towards how people feel about Africa's relationship with the Queen, especially in a Commonwealth context, in a post-colonial context.
And Ejike Okpa, you know, we've seen the conversations. I see you that you also engage a lot of, you know, global citizens on the social, you know, space. And Africans have been about on this matter to the extent that people are asking, hey, haven't Africans, you know, done enough to proceed from that position of thinking about colonialism till this moment? Is it right in time for any African to say a word about colonialism on the death of the monarch?
Well, thank you for having me on the show, and then thank the other two guests for joining. I think you have read something I wrote about, you know, when she passed or when the news came that she passed. Let me just say personally, I am not anybody who mourns the death of somebody who I know of as opposed to who I know. You know, so condolences to the family, condolences to the monarchy, condolences to anybody who feels somebody significant in their life as life goes on. The Queen was in office for, 70 years, longer than. And so the question that needs to be asked is, where is Africa? Independently, I don't like to group the 54 African countries as if it's just one lump sum, country. There are 54 African countries. Which African country will stand up today and raise their hand and say, oh, they have been a successful beneficiary of having copied or pasted anything that the UK did or the Queen told them to do. So my thing is, at what time do Africa?
Well, I think there seems to be a glitch there on the connection to Ejike Okpa. Okay, I think you're back. Yeah, I see you back. I apologize. We lost you for a bit today.
So what I was saying is that at what point, at what time, do we, grow out of these former colonial influences in Africa? 70 years on the throne, which African country would come out today and wave a hand and say, hey, we were successful because of our relationship with America was colonized, and that colonization led them to do things differently. Their form of government does not mirror the British parliamentary system,
Well, not again. Looks like I lost the line. I'll expect that we make a reconnection with Ejike Okpa to establish a better connection. But quickly, let me come back to you, Professor Munene. The Queen is globally respected, but she's been accused of overseeing some events that threatened the respect for humanity, especially on the continent. How does that hold, looking at our history as a continent?
Well, there are three phases that one can talk about with regard to Queen Elizabeth. Yes, she became queen while in Kenya watching some animals, and at that time Kenya was some sort of the British imperialism. And so she had come to see part of her property. And then the bad thing happened, her father died, so she became a queen while watching animals in Kenya, figuratively. Now, the reaction in Kenya at the time, the white people cried because the king had died, and the Africans just looked at them wondering what they are crying about. And it was at a time that the country was simmering. The Mau Mau War was about to break. And so within a short time after she left, go back, the war broke out. So there is that association, and the atrocities that the British government committed in Kenya may be associated with her because she was the monarch. And there were those people who looked at her as a symbol of the bad things. So the hotel where she had stayed, the treetops, the Mau Mau burnt it down as a kind of symbolic reaction to her prominence. And when she was being crowned, the coronation, these people went out of their way to find a young girl and said they are also going to crown their own queen. So they had a Mau Mau queen crowned to divert attention from the British queen or the English queen on that side. So during that period, the 1950s, she was a symbol of everything that was wrong with England or with Britain because of their colonial behavior and attitude. That changed a little bit in the transition from colonialism to independence, and that wave of independence and overseeing the fragmentation of the British Empire, because that's what it was fragmenting. And she seemed to have taken it very well in actually saying yes and sending her family members to go and give the instruments of independence to the various colonies. And the very gesture of doing that rubbed people the right way. They liked it because they really did not have a quarrel with her as a person. They had a quarrel with the system that she represented. So for her to oversee this smooth transition from colonialism to independence although organized in such a way that those who perpetuate British control and British interests are the ones to take over from the colonial states.
Let me jump in here so that I can come to Professor Nyamunda, and I'm looking at periods here. Nyamunda, do you think Queen Elizabeth followed the practice of periods? I'm talking about how did she change in the subsequent years? Was there any kind of change looking at the periods from when she was crowned till her demise? I can barely hear you. Perhaps maybe your microphone is still on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
All right, wonderful. Now, I was saying that I suppose she had to adjust over time, because when she got crowned in 1952, Britain was experiencing a very difficult economic period, just, after facing the impact of 2 world wars and a depression. And it had just lost, particularly India, which was one of its most strategic and important colonies. But for its post-war recovery, it needed its colonies. So it entered into a sort of second colonial occupation of Africa. And this was a context in which, liberal democratic values and principles were beginning to shift, and the United States was coming into prominence as a global superpower. So at this particular time, the thinking was very much about digging into empire and seeing how best empire can help revitalize Britain in the 1950s. And this was during the time of, like I said earlier, Winston Churchill. But, after the Suez debacle in 1956, we see the, Anthony Eden, who had succeeded Winston Churchill, giving way to power to, in 1957, to Macmillan, who comes out with this whole notion of, the winds of change. Remember his speech in 1960 in Cape Town, or was it 1959? I'll just correct the facts there. So you do see that over time she needed to change, and she needed to adjust and to adapt. So if you look at the Queen in the 1950s, certainly the thinking at that particular time is how best to revamp the British economy, to revitalize the British Empire. But certainly after the 1960s, with the shift in policy, she needed to be seen to be supporting African independence. So she always told the line that Whitehall, the British Parliament itself, always took. And certainly with the wave of independence across Africa, you actually see the monarch supporting all of these African independence celebration as a signal to say that whatever history of colonialism Britain had, or whatever colonial relations or imperial colonial relations Britain had with Africa, they were beginning to shift. What they were shifting to is certainly open for debate. Whether the kinds of relations that were established in the Commonwealth and in other forums was equal is also something that we can also discuss. But the point is, the Queen had to be dynamic and had to shift over time and to change with the times. She certainly retained a certain image of herself, of being this dignified, benevolent monarch. But of course, that was necessitated by the need to change with the times so that Britain could maintain the relations that it had once held with African countries. I mean, we can always discuss the nature of the relationships and the nature of Britain's political and economic position as, the discussion continues, but certainly the Queen had to adjust and change over time as well and move with the times to some extent.
Okay, let me bring in Ejike. Again, apologies, we lost you for a bit there. I'll let you conclude your train of thought, but quickly let me throw this in, and it has to do with, you said something which resonated with some, Africans and some other global citizens. Life goes on. Brexit, the death of the Queen, and we can see a change in approach from Britain in terms of its relations with Africa. Ejike, help us. How do you see the Queen's death affecting the continent, going by, conversations that people in government and outside government have been, making?
Okay, can you hear me now? Am I clear?
You're clear. I can hear you.
Okay. Well, I mean, you just flip the coin. If the Queen was a Black African woman, who would care? Who would care? What shocks me is, the way Africans have found themselves unable to withdraw even from sources and influences that have kept them where they are. Again, we all gonna have to pay the debt of life, which is, when we die, we move on. But Africans seems to have these, nostalgic attachment to even institutions and influences and people that family, condolences to the monarchy, condolences to anybody who feel that they have lost a grandma, a mother, whatever the case may be. I don't feel that way. My thing is Africa has become the doormat, of everybody, appeasement to make Africans to feel, oh, we are still with you. Now, don't forget, a lot of Africans' stolen wealth and money are hiding in some European institutions, and Britain is known to be the host of that. So while the Queen was there for 70 years, longer than most African countries have been independent, did she at any time make any statement and say, you know what, we want to maintain relationship with this? I want somebody to tell me. I don't care about the history, how long she was there, and who started this. Monarchies, as far as I'm concerned, I'm a citizen, I'm not a subject. Monarchies are a dead institution from whenever they started. Countries that are relevant, that means well for themselves, supposed to start to look inward to develop their own economy and then have relationships. It was this same the Commonwealth. So no, I don't want it. I'm going to go develop my own relationship. And then I'm going to be in bed with whomever we want. It's the Africans, just like the Nigerians. After all these things, they start running around and want to take the title of Sir. Americans don't do that. You don't see people running and, kneeling down and you are knighted by the British Empire, blah, blah. These are the people that colonize you. And remember, when a lot of African countries were being colonized, Britain was struggling to survive war. So how can it be somebody who hasn't even gotten their own household right, has you under bondage? You remember, most African countries started becoming independent in the 50s, except for Egypt, Egypt in 1922. A lot of them, the sub-Saharan ones, was after in the 50s. So here was somebody who was fighting a war to survive in their own continent, but they still held you as their own token country, controlling you as to what you do.
I think that's some glitch, I'm experiencing in the connection to Ejike, which is surprising. I'm hoping I can get this sorted out. This is the first time we're getting that, from Ejike's line. But quickly, let's bring you Professor Munene. When we recall, because listening, I'm excited that we have all three gentlemen here, and Ejike has spoken, and he's brought a perspective that is worthy of mention. So let's stretch it, Professor Munene. When we recall some of the British rather high-handed approach, like the crushing of Kenya's Mau Mau rebellion, how easy can it be for such a people to let go?
Well, people consider the circumstances under which some things happened. The Mau Mau War was atrocious. People were tortured, they died. But very interestingly, the fighters themselves sometimes made a distinction between the people on the ground, the people committing atrocities, and some others that they could sometimes appeal to. The colonial state was a slave state. That one is doubt. And sometimes making the distinction who in the colonial state was the slave master, the slave driver, and the others who are maybe pointing out that something was wrong. So the people, once independence was attained, and there was seemingly a smooth transition, we have now, at present, 70% of the population in the world, in Africa, really has very little knowledge or connection with colonialism and its atrocities. What they know are post-colonial challenges. How those challenges came to be is another matter. And the image that Elizabeth portrayed of herself and England was positive as much as it could be to most of the people. So they may not say that they want to be under the British law, they don't want that. But there is nothing wrong in noticing whether there was something admirable, likable about Elizabeth. And there was. The fact that she visited many places, former colonies, and emitted positive vibrations. Those people who saw her and had very little knowledge of the colonial experience had no reason to be hostile to her. Not to forget about the post-colonial Africa was really a neo-colonial Africa, because those people who inherited the colonial states were properly groomed and nurtured to take over in order to perpetuate the interest of the colonial state, the colonial masters. Only that the new players that were admired and held in high esteem were black, and the bad ones have been white. But the institutions and the structures did not change. They remain the same. And so we had even people who became leaders, ministers, presidents, who are more concerned with admiring European manners and European things than running their own country properly. And that can also be traced to the colonial experience, because these people are properly groomed to behave that way. In a way, that behavior becomes a self-justification for saying that the Africans have failed, and which then we excuse colonialism for that. And that in itself, we have had people saying, is a tragedy, because colonialism was tragic in itself. But that does not take away the fact that Elizabeth was a pleasant person. And wherever she went, she was received very well. And people had good reasons to like her, just the way you like other people in other countries. We have had examples of Africans who used to admire John Kennedy. I mean, they did not become Americans, and they did not think that Kennedy was an African, but they admired him. There was something about it that they liked. And the other presidents that have had that admiration. And there are also others whom people don't want to talk about because they were terrible in their behavior, in their personalities, and the way they related with Africa. So what we have here was Elizabeth, once colonialism was over, territorial colonialism, she made effort to make the Commonwealth look good. And that's why there were a lot of countries trying to be part of it.
And Professor Munene, sorry, I need to butt in here, because when you talk about the effort that she made, in bringing the Commonwealth of Nations together, Professor Nyamunda, I wanted to speak on the concerns of Ejike. Ejike has raised a very important concern here. He used the word bondage. That's number one. Then secondly, Ejike also thinks that, look, many of the African leaders who have, pilfered from the continent, store their wealth or what they have stolen in places like Great Britain. And there were articles of great respect and resource that some have said that the Queen took away from Africa when she left. For example, diamonds acquired from colonial times, which the throne never returned. How can these standpoints be properly thrashed out, Professor Nyamunda? I need your mic to be on, please.
It's on. I was saying I didn't hear the very last sentence, the very last question.
No, I'm asking, looking at some of the things, some of the concerns Ejike raised about the African leaders, the bad African leaders who have stolen from the continent and stashed these wealth, outside in Europe and specifically in Britain, and also for those who are concerned about some of the resources that the Queen may have taken away from Africa when she lived, talking about diamonds acquired during colonial times, which were never returned. So some are asking, how can these standpoints be properly trashed out?
Yeah, that's a very difficult one, but I do agree with the critical point that you make, and with the point that the other panelists are making, that you can never justify colonialism, at least from an African standpoint. But certainly it is a historical reality that we cannot run away from. And, whatever the Queen's death has conjured up in terms of African emotions, it is unsurprising that you'd get a lot of people remembering the fact that there was quite a lot of plundering during the colonial period, that a lot of resources were taken out. And that is something to certainly reflect on. Should some of those artifacts, some of those resources be brought back? Certainly, if there's a way to do so, perhaps people could try. I know for a fact that a number of Kenyans are, taking their cases to the British courts to get compensation for the loss of land, for the atrocities that were suffered during the Mau Mau revolt, or uprising rather. I think that's a more appropriate term. But there's only so much that we're able to do, because, for instance, the British Treasury for a significant period of time in British history was actually to some degree financed by the slave trade in Africa before the British eventually decided that slavery was inhumane and it needed to be abolished, but in any case making way for colonialism. So certainly, if there are ways to repatriate some of those artifacts, or if there are ways, for example, to get reparations for some of those colonial ills, those possibilities should be explored. But the question about African leadership it's a curious one, in the sense that certainly the British have, in many instances, spoken out against undemocratic governments, authoritarian rule, and so forth. Although in some instances, one may feel that there's a certain degree of lip service that is being paid to that. However, we cannot necessarily always blame British colonialism for some of the problems that occur in Africa. Some of those things are subject to our own introspection, to try to think about whatever negative impact colonialism has had on African politics and economics. How responsible are we for some of the challenges that we are facing? So to answer that question, it's very difficult for me to connect African bad political leadership, if we could call it that, dictatorships, authoritarianism, to the Queen's reign. In any case, she had become increasingly more of a ceremonial figurehead than an actual politician. So some of those questions about Britain's responses to African authoritarian rule, or whatever is happening in many of these different African spaces, perhaps lies at the door of Whitehall, and they are better placed to comment on all of these things. The best the monarchy could do, I suppose, is to simply make a passing comment about that. But at the end of the day, I suppose the question really has to do with what the Queen's death represents, with what the monarchy represents. And for me, it represents a past, right, an imperial past that Britain has since surpassed. As a waning power, you mentioned Brexit earlier on. The challenges that Britain has gone through ever since Brexit, I don't know just how many prime ministers, I'm losing count, how many prime ministers that they've gone through since Brexit. particularly because of the challenges that they're facing in Britain. Talk about, you know, the challenges with Scotland wanting to leave the United Kingdom. All of those are clear indicators that the British Empire that we knew prior to the Second World War is not the same kind of British Empire that we have now. So the question of the future of the British monarchy and the connections that it has with African countries, I think, is increasingly shifting away from focus on the monarchy to focusing on particularly British parliamentary or British government relations with those African countries. I really think that the monarchy is going to continue to become increasingly insignificant in terms of global politics. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, gentlemen, just quickly here, a bit of information before I come to Ejike. In March of 2021, the British government published a vision document, Global Britain in a Competitive Age, the Integrated Review of Security, Defense, Development and Foreign Policy. The document also showed that the Department for International Development, and that is the DFID, has partnered with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office to become a new Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. Now, these are some of the moves by the British government to reduce the volume of its relations with Africa. Financially, there are lesser investments in Africa, and the death of the Queen may also come with its impacts. Now, as we round off, we custom to our anchor point tonight. Let me go back to Ejike. And Ejike, you know, let's talk about the lifestyles. Some have called it the subservient lifestyles of Africans, which they probably got from Britain. Some have said, why, if only Africans had taken the rebellious, you know, lifestyles as seen in Americans, even to the extent that the light switch is actually turned the other way, and in protest of how the switch is in Great Britain. So what are those things that the continent isn't doing to have made the continent still talk about colonialism after many years? Ejike.
Well, you know, again, the African, the black race, you know, they have basically given up on themselves. They are looking for who to copy, and oftentimes when they do the copying, they don't know how to paste what is going to be good for them. So, you talk of America, why do we drink coffee? Because we had the Boston Tea Party, which was a protest against the British colonial rule. You know, there are so many things we've done. We don't have Your Majesty. We don't address our president by His Excellencies. You know, arm stretching and the elasticity of the British influence on them. Not. They've already tried to run after them and see what it is they're going to copy to appease the Queen or the monarchy and say, oh, we're still with you. You don't need to be with them. You need to let them know, I'm tired of this relationship. It hasn't been productive. Go your way to your tent, O Israel. Africans don't know how to do it because they are timid, they are afraid to be bold in order to pursue the things that are going to be beneficial to them. The gentleman from Kenya talked about how Kenyans, you know, are approaching the British people to release or return what was stolen. The Kenyan government needs to pass a national resolution. The government needs to do it. You know, when that resolution is passed, individuals can build their strength on it and start to make noise. You know, you talk about the Queen has been nice to everybody. I have asked the question, how many African countries today can monarchy cannot be excused from how the British government operates, because the Queen is always the one who gives the right to any prime minister to go form the government. So there's a tie in there. So, you know, the monarchy is not like what you have in Africa, you know, like the emir of whatever the local chiefs are. They have no influence. So the Queen or whomever occupies that high point is very responsible for and remember the war in Falkland, when back in the 80s, they say, hey, we want to be an independent, and the Queen, you know, the British people went and fought this tiny island to take it back. So what I'm saying is, I'm not even concerned about her history and her death and all of those things. I'm saying, okay, African countries to receive him on a state visit. And then naive Africans are going to line up these streets. Kids that are not being fed are going to line up on the street to wave flag and die. If I was an African country president, that would not happen. I said, let's do a Zoom call. We can talk about stuff, but you're not coming here and my people are going to line up. How many African heads of states have visited England or UK and the kids are along the streets to wait for them? These are things you have to start asking yourself. You don't need to be reminding yourself. You don't even have your own identity. There are 54 African countries. I'm looking for one that will be bold enough to put in an image that promotes their own brand. Let the Queen has done her time, she's gone. You know, who knows who else is gonna come, but whoever is gonna come, Africans is so to say. Yeah, we don't need it, we don't want it, we can figure this out ourselves. But as long as we keep running after them and doing all these things, then they're going to look at us as inferior. Which university in the world is it that an African hasn't attended? So how come after we are giving that? Look, it took some kids from Kenya, from Britain, when Kibaki was president, to devalue the shilling. In Kenya today, thousands of land are owned by the British Army. Okay, if you don't want to kick them out, what you can do is you negotiate a lease as if that land was in England or UK and let them pay you the equivalent value. That's how you show you are bold. You can't just be there, people come in and occupy your house, kick you away from your bedroom, your matters, and put you in the boys' quarter. God did not make a mistake giving us life, but instead we have become doormats. We have been willingly submitted to be subdued, and nobody's going to pull us up until we pull ourselves up. I don't want to talk about the Queen dying. I don't want to talk about it. But what am I doing today to enhance my life and hopefully become an inspiration for people that look like me? I don't want to have this conversation about her. She's a great woman. If she was a male,
well,
I'm saying this is what that's her appeal. Okay, she's a grandma. She comes in soft, and gentle, and people, tend to gravitate towards that. If that was a man, I don't think that would have lasted. But again, bless her heart, she's done her job, she's moved on. We got to move on.
Yeah, at this point, I'll bring in Professor Munene. We have to move on, and in moving on, we had this conversation before, in 2021, Professor Munene, some of the key things Africa isn't doing to ensure that it can actually be a continent that not only takes care of its own, but also looks after other continents, Professor Munene. Your microphone is off, Professor Munene.
Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay. What I'm saying is that there is need for an attitude revolution, and that revolution must be rooted in the history of colonial contacts, the colonial setup, destroyed independence for Africans, legitimacy and sovereignty. The current countries are creations of Europeans in the image of the Europeans for the purposes of the Europeans. So the revolution that needs to take place is an attitude one, how to reorganize, rethink the countries because they cannot be dismantled. That's the agreement that was reached. But then the thinking, the leadership, the control needs some new, a fresh look that will change things, to eliminate the idea, this notion of dependence. Because one of the things that was implanted in many African countries is that they are dependent. They have to continue being dependent. Now, changing that attitude requires a changing of mind, a revolutionary change of mind, so that people stop thinking that they need somebody else to get anything done. That one is a difficult one. But then to understand how difficult it is, you have to go back to the colonial conditioning that was there for the generations. People are conditioned to believe or to think that they needed the Europeans in order to continue being. And that, changing that is going to be a difficult task, because some of the beneficiaries, those who benefit from that conditioning, are very powerful. They have very linkages from outside, the powerful ones, that will ensure that they continue being. So it is not an easy thing, one way or the other.
No doubt, not an easy thing, Professor Munene. But before I go to Professor Nyamunda, let us expatiate on this. When you talk about attitude revolution, who should drive this?
Particularly the intellectuals, they need to, and the people in the know. They need to, first of all, study and let people know, they discuss these things in the open, that you do not need advice on how to run your country from some other place, whether it is Europe or the North Americans or the Asian countries. It is a self-reliant issue. And once that is internalized, then it's possible now to start developing strategies and policies that will ensure that dependency is reduced. And once it's reduced, then you are moving in the right direction. The reality is that the enemies will not allow that to happen very easily, because they'll find a way of sabotaging the effort to be liberated.
Tinashe Nyamunda, you know, what histories need to be told about the activities of the British people that may cause a positive reaction?
Yes. I think there's quite a lot of history that has been told, colonial history, imperial colonial economic relations and so forth, and it continues to be told by a community of excellent historians who are emerging out of the African continent, actually. And a lot of those histories obviously focus on disparate numbers of issues, whether it's the political legacies of British colonial rule, or it's the economic history that has resulted in different countries' positions in terms of global economics today, or it's about culture, society, and so forth. All of these histories are being told. But I think what is particularly important is to not look at British-Africa relations as frozen in time, right? And to not look at Africa merely as a victim without its own agency. I recently read an article a few weeks ago which was talking about how we mustn't take African agency for granted. Certainly, we're living in a context of, for example, Black Lives Matter. We've been looking at movements such as Rhodes Must Fall, decoloniality movements, and so forth. So despite all of this history, Africans have found numerous ways of expressing themselves and trying to make a mark in terms of who they are and what they aspire to be. What the death of Queen Elizabeth II represents, at least for me, is that this is an institution that, despite having been around for such a long time, is becoming insignificant over time as well, right? The institution of the monarchy itself. And in fact, if you look at the rising of all of those Asian nations, the rise of China, for instance, if you look at developing global stories such as the Russia-Ukraine war, you begin to notice that even Western hegemony itself is beginning to be significantly challenged. So for me, the big story coming out of Africa, the big history that we mustn't ignore, is not so much just about the exploitation of the colonial experience that African countries have endured, but also the promise that comes out of that, the idea that they're able to challenge these systems, these histories, these institutions, and try to rethink them. And for me, I would want to sort of take this conversation to a note of hope, the position of knowing, or at least of acknowledging that this history is fully well known, but the Africans themselves have the capacity to go beyond, to challenge it, to endure against it, and in fact to become liberated, whatever we make of that liberation. And certainly there's a lot of promise coming out of all of the movements that these young people are participating in to try and chart a new future for the countries on the continent.
And Ejike, your closing moment here with us, because you've spoken, you've written about, attitude revolution as used by Professor Munene. What are those things that Africans should do to take off the docility, to take away, the put-down attitude and, naivety in pursuing a cause that will ultimately turn around things for the continent?
Well, look, the solutions are there, but the thing is the will. I mean, Africans are very wishful people. They often don't about attitude adjustment, what individuals are doing. You have to look at the Western world. The Western world don't care about the individual; they care about the institution behind the individual. So, if African, AU, for instance, were to pass a resolution condemning certain things, no African president or head of state should have money in a foreign account. Community and the domestic community to go after that and shame you and expose you. These are the things when you start to say it, it will grab attention. But if you and I are just having this village communication or beer parlor, it doesn't mean anything. Or the West African ECOWAS. The Kenyans, the Nigerians, the Ghanaians need to go to their National Assembly or Parliament and say, we are passing this. Even when your president is sick, they should not seek treatment overseas. But are Africans strong enough to say that? They won't. They want individuals to talk about it. I live in America. When we want to get something done, and that gives you an enabling power to do it. I'm just saying, if we don't wait for, you don't have to wait for attitude adjustment. Start to pass resolutions and laws that our president cannot do this, nobody should do this, nobody should wire money from Kenyan account or this account for public money and have it staying in a foreign account as laws. This is pass it, but we're not doing it. We want to dance around the problem with the hope that, oh, God is going to bless us and love us. God was alive when slavery was going on. Jesus was alive when all those things did anything stop. We are looking for divine intervention.
Looks like a fine place for us
to change that brand.
Absolutely, Ejike. I'd like to thank you all, gentlemen, for being such nice company, for doing all of this for the continent. Ejike Okpa, Macharia Munene, and Tinashe Nyamunda. Thank you, and we do hope to see you again here on the square. And to all those watching from across the continent and beyond, I'm Sulaiman. See you again.